Live now. That's neat.
Great. All right. Well, I think we can kick things off. Welcome, everyone. We've got an illustrious panel here today that's going to be lending their thoughts on the impact of the coronavirus pandemic and how it might help move Game B societies forward. First of all, for those that don't know what Game B is, we're watching this through the Game B Community's Facebook page, and Game B is more of a collective approach to community building and design. So essentially the opposite of the capitalist winner-takes-all approach where competition and division runs wild. And my name's Karen Flavell. I'm the host of the panel and founder of Casaba, that's Casaba with a K, a co-retreat center being set up in Northern California with a focus on sharing time and space in nature for co-working, tending to a vegetable patch and cooking up feasts. One thing that I've really observed since the quarantine's been enforced is how many people are interested in wanting to grow their own food and also really being in nature and noticing it, and also how much business has been able to adapt to being remote. So I'm part of the Game B communities on Facebook, and I've invited some of the other members of the group to discuss where the opportunities might lay as a result of the coronavirus. So I've met some of these people and I see them as thought leaders in the evolution of how we decentralize to regional areas and help to regenerate the land using permaculture and smart energy solutions. So let's start the conversation by going around the circle to get some background on each of the speakers. First of all, let's start with Mark Fraser. Mark's the chairman of the Startup Societies Foundation and president of Open World, a non-profit research group specializing in land value appreciation as a means of privately funding public goods. Mark, tell us your interest in Game B communities and how they present a better system for the future.
Sure. For many decades, I've been intrigued by the prospects that voluntary societies, mutual self-help, can do better for all than the kind of top-down systems that are based on political control. And so I went into this journey very inspired by writers that were into the same kind of way of seeing the world. But I quickly got intrigued by how can we make actual examples of these. So I dove deep as a consultant into how to create depoliticized areas, which thankfully now there are many thousands of, or hundreds of thousands even, both in this realm of residential communities, the growth of housing co-ops and condominium associations and HOAs, and also in the business realm, where it's often very difficult for entrepreneurs to get, legally up and running. I concentrated on how policy reforms could be making a phase change in terms of leveling the playing field. So I've worked in about close to 60 countries on these kind of projects, special economic zones and private residential communities. But I come from the left, and my approach in this has been not in terms of how enclaves of privilege basically can be established, but how there can be wider benefit. So I'm very much a believer in land trust, community land trust models, where the better you can get things in a community in terms of conviviality, but also in terms of deep policy change, the more the land values can jump for shared benefit. So that is probably going overly long, but that's how I came into Game B. Jim Rutt, Jordan Hall were good enough to include me in the very earliest of the meetings, and I've stayed part of Game B since then. And I'm excited now to see it emerging in terms of a focus of actual communities of the sort that everyone here has been working on.
Yeah, and I've enjoyed your book, Mark, the Startup Societies, and I know we need to do a public service announcement at the end about the summit, the Smart Startup Society Summit on May 1st. We'll more of that later. Thanks very much, Mark. So next, let's talk to Colleen, hear from Colleen Dick. She has a master's degree in nutrition and is a big believer in localized nature-based food systems. She's been working as a promoter of permaculture with the Onchenda online farmers market and other regenerative disciplines for the last 5 years. She's developed concepts for regenerative demonstration villages of the future, which is called State of Grace Living, now incorporated as a Utah Benefit Corporation. So Colleen, how do you think the current crisis will impact regenerative practices and initiatives, and what got you started in this space?
Well, I'm hoping that it will really open people's eyes so that they can see that what we've been doing previously is pretty fragile, and maybe have new ways of looking at things. I think that that's a really important part of the Game B philosophy, is that we see the problems in our current society and come up with alternatives that are better. State of Grace Living is kind of a flagship kind of initiative for regenerative living. And when I first came to this idea, it was out of desperation, because I could see that all of my nutrition patients were having difficulty finding the quality of food that they really needed. And so I went through several different iterations, but finally came up with the idea of what would it look like if we had the best of all the regenerative technologies in one village, and then we could invite people to come there to learn and to go forth and create bioregional centers based on regenerative knowledge, rather than the short-term gains that we've been getting for the last little while. And so it's kind of turned into something that has a whole new value system. We're tired of greed. We know that people are a lot more productive when they're cooperative with each other than when they're trying to compete with one another. We also have found that we need to address the reality of the life forces that are around us. It's a complex system, and we keep trying to simplify it instead of learn from it. And so we need to see nature as a mentor and a friend rather than an enemy. And instead of trying constantly to be getting ahead, and perhaps what we need to start thinking about is balance, rather than just wrestling everything to the ground and trying to take advantage of everything. So that's basically where I'm coming from with all of this.
Beautiful. Thanks, Colleen. Now I'd like to hear from your business partner, Harrison Quigley, who's a social entrepreneur and co-founder of Onchenda, the Open Global Food Cooperative, a benefit corporation. He's addressing the fragility of food production and distribution system with a startup of distributed network of online farmers markets. So Harrison, love to hear how you got into this, and how, if there's been some sort of uptick you've seen in online farmers markets as a result of the current crisis.
I think Game B basically is a moniker for something, or a viewpoint, or an ethos that a lot of us have been entertaining for decades, probably. And now it's starting to coalesce around the name of Game B. I lived in Australia for 3 years back in the 80s, where I got introduced to permaculture there. And just looking at things from a whole systems point of view, it became very apparent to me that one of the fundamental things that we all need to have is good, nutritious food. You can't do anything without good, nutritious food. It brings people together. It makes people healthy. It improves the environment, the ecosystem. If it's done properly, many of the problems, it's kind of like the fundamental thing that underlies a lot of other problems. So I started to come up with different ways to popularize and promote alternative methods of producing good, nutritious food utilizing nature rather than chemicals and machines and warfare to create volume. We're great at creating volume, but we're not very good at creating nutrition, basically. So we wind up with toxic food and huge, long supply chains that the average in the United States is the food that winds up on your plate travels 1,500 miles, which is kind of ridiculous. And how many hands does it go through? And how much energy is required for that food to get from 1,500 miles away to your plate? And you know, it's just extremely wasteful, toxic, silly. And it's based on extractivism for, you know, vertically integrated corporations. Whereas, for example, Russia, 60% of their food comes from backyards. So we don't need to have big corporate extractivists feeding us things that are making us sick and ruining the environment. And so there are alternative ways to do this. And permaculture has been around for over 40 years, and so worldwide movement. Agroecology now is replacing conventional agriculture. So now with the advances that we have with technology, it's relatively easy to take someone who is producing food and allow them to sell it directly to the consumer within a 50, 100-mile radius. So Anchendo was designed to promote that viewpoint and those alternative technologies for producing good food that's nutritious, regenerates the environment, maintains local financial resilience. And I have seen an uptick, especially since people have to have, they're not going to the grocery store that much even anymore. In fact, I saw something recently that the grocery store may be a source of contagion. So now what do? You get everything from Amazon. Well, where's that food coming from, right? How is that raised? Who's touching that on the way? Whereas in our system, the food goes from the farmer to the delivery guy to the consumer. Bang, bang, bang. And we have like a profile on our website so you can go see who is the person that's raising your food. How are they doing it? What methods are they using? What methods aren't they using? Which is almost more important. And because they're within a fairly close radius, you can actually go visit them and meet them and see what they're doing and become friends with them so that the source of your food can be from somebody you actually know and trust. Wouldn't that be awesome? Rather than some, how do you know how good the food is that you're eating now? You got a label. You look at a label, right? A government label. Now, maybe it's a good label, maybe it's not, We didn't have these problems before all the mechanization and the huge supply chains and all of the waste that's built into our existing food production and distribution infrastructure. So why do we need that? Obviously, with this COVID thing, we recognize, wait, maybe we don't need that. So Anchendo was designed to address the fragility and wastefulness of the existing food production and distribution system. And now people, because they've been forced to change their habits, are starting to go, oh, I could actually get fresh local food right over the internet and it'll be brought to my home. So we're starting to now get some traction.
That's great. And it's funny that both of you are talking about nutrition when, you know, we're looking at a threat that is directly to our immunity. So brilliant. Switching gears a little to Maria Saxton, who received her PhD from Virginia Tech in environmental design and planning and wrote her dissertation on the environmental benefits of downsizing to tiny homes. She's currently an environmental planner and housing expert at A&E firm at an A&E firm in Virginia. Maria, thanks for joining. And how do you see, what got you into, you know, looking at what interests you about looking at tiny homes, and also, you know, how do you see tiny homes as being part of the movement to Game B communities?
Yeah, great question. Well, the history of my interest in tiny homes really stemmed from a project that Virginia Tech did in 2012. They designed something called the Lumen House, which was for the 2012 Solar Decathlon. And I was involved with that project, and that really got me interested in the idea of small scale living, resiliency, and that led me to stay for my graduate degree. And I wanted to explore what really happens to people's environmental impacts when they downsize, specifically to these tiny homes. So not only how do their housing behaviors change, but how do their food behaviors change? How does their transportation change? How do the goods they buy change? The services they use? So from that, I did some consulting in the tiny home world after I finished my degree. Specifically, I looked at tiny home communities and how we can develop them responsibly. And that's how I met Mark. So him and I have been working on the idea of creating kind of a how-to guide for developing tiny home eco-villages. And that's kind of what led me to be interested in this Game B concept, along with Mark introducing me to the concept as well. I think it's really, really interesting because it allows people to foster their individual interests. So whether it be, you know, me and housing and tiny homes, or, you know, Harrison and Colleen with food production, whatever your interest is, it allows you to really hone in on this towards a healthier and a more cooperative society that everybody benefits from. So for tiny homes specifically, I think that they lend themselves to that kind of mindset where you want to be more resilient, you want to be more financially independent. And I think that that's very in line with the Game B community realm.
Yeah, yeah. I've been really thinking about the people that would typically go shopping, you know, on the weekend to Macy's and be, you know, just buying stuff. And you know, hopefully this quarantine is going to break that habit just a little bit. Mm-hmm. And, you know, even the concept of living with less, you know, I mean, I live tiny, so going shopping really isn't a great thing because it just causes a problem. So, you know, I just wonder how that's going to impact people. All right, last but not least is Stuart Allen. He's a tech founder whose success is rooted in pragmatic, ground-up, first principles engineering that often find him at odds with established conventional wisdom. He's creator of Last Resort, a system to empower Game B's communities. And I've had a wonderful long conversation with Stuart, so I'm excited to hear about your thoughts on what got you interested in Last Resort and the work that you're doing to, you know, help empower Game B communities.
Sure, thanks. The roots of Last Resort, which is a very recent effort for me, actually go back about 15 years or so. So I'll just start with the thesis, of which COVID-19 is actually a really stark example of exactly the kind of thing that I've been designing for, or sort of trying to guard against. So the thesis is there are going to be increasingly large population migrations over time due to climate change, natural disasters, economic upheaval, what have you. And that those people are not going to find new homes in cities and towns that exist today for a lot of reasons, the most of which is that they're just not well governed. They don't have good infrastructure for, you know, sort of scaling out the things that they, you know, want to do 30 years from now should have been done 30 years ago. So it's like, it's a mismatch between the speed of change and what they're able to accommodate. And I don't even think that's where people are going to want to move. And in the case of COVID-19, what we see is that density is actually the worst thing you can have for a situation like this. And so you have people trying to or wanting to move out of high density areas, and it sort of is an impetus to get people in the direction of where we want to go with these Game B communities, which is like, you know, the startup communities, new greenfield communities. And so what I say about Last Resorts is it's designed to create the technologies and the templates that we need to deploy communities at scale. And so the reason for that is we're going to have to create thousands, tens of thousands of these things. And so it's not okay just to sort of get one or two working successfully. We have to actually deploy this in a really large scale. And so my background is in large scale distributed systems is one of my backgrounds. And how do you actually take something and sort of scale it out, you know, hugely. So really it is reducing to simplicity the components that you need to actually do this. And we want to work with a reduced palette of things that are readily available and reusable, not recyclable, reusable, you know, so, you know, wood, glass, steel, things like that. And the things that I'm focusing on are primarily construction and governance. And I think that there's a lot of really interesting stuff happening with power and power generation and water reclamation and things like that and other infrastructure. And so I'm pragmatically going after construction because the way we build things today actually just doesn't, it just defies logic. Everything that we build is basically future landfill. So there's nothing reusable. It relies on a huge raw stream of sources that you're going to basically build things, and they're not geared toward how they adapt for the future. So whatever we design and build now, we know we're going to have to change and adapt going forward. You have to think decades in advance. And so it's not sufficient to just sort of break things. Just think about drywall. The way you put it up and the way you change it, fix it, uncorrelated. You're basically just producing garbage. And it's even true with things like bricks and stuff. They're not really reusable and not even very strong. So I think in order to deploy communities at scale, we're going to have to rethink construction from the ground up. And so that's something I've actually been working on for about a decade. And so it folds into the Last Resort effort. So again, COVID-19, I think, is going to push people in the direction of these communities. You know, it came earlier than, I think things like this are coming earlier than I expected. You know, I always wanted to do this like years and years ago, but I've been sort of waylaid in one startup after another, and I worked on these in between or on the side. But now it's a full-time thing. Hopefully it's the last thing that I do.
Yeah. Well, I love how everyone's coming at this from really different disciplines and knowledge and skills. But all of them seem to have a common theme, and that is that we need land. So is there going to be a land grab as a result of COVID-19? What's your predictions in terms of, you know, the, you know, where and how people are going to get onto land? And anyone chime in at this point. So the open conversation.
2008, and before that, when the savings and loans had their woes in the early 90s, late 80s, there was a big transfer of land to banks, also to, in the case of many municipalities where governance has been a big challenge, people have walked away. They've defaulted tax payment on taxes. So Detroit, not too many years ago, had a vacant land holdings, abandoned buildings that were equivalent to the size of Boston. And it was reaching the point where people at open auction could buy a broken down house for $500 on a quarter-acre lot. So now if we're heading into the biggest downturn since the Depression, I think it's very clear we're leveraged all through and through the economy, that the ability of people to maintain payments on properties, these highly leveraged commercial properties and office buildings, it is just a recipe for a massive collapse in property markets. And I think this could be the opening for Game B communities and for the hundreds of thousands of condominium associations, homeowner associations, and housing co-ops to position in terms of already having some kind of trusted governance through these contractual universal membership associations to essentially fill the void, but do it in a way where if land is coming in to common ownership, that the land value jump that can happen with good governance and reliable infrastructure and innovative construction, that these can lead to multiples in terms of the value of lands that will be idle in any other scenario or most other scenarios. So this was a big reason Joseph McKinney and I prepared a book called Founding Startup Societies on how these land trust-based and what are called endowment zone-based systems could respond to a massive, once in an epic kind of land conveyance opportunity, and do it under leaseholds rather than outright individual ownership. So there's a way to fund things for the commons.
I'd like to just mention on the fact that the average farmer in the United States is age 65. And a lot of them have legacy farms that have been in the family for generations. But, they're basically getting too old to work all that land. And there's tax incentives for having land under cultivation. So there's a lot of land, excuse me, that's actually fallow and costing the old farmers money because it's not under cultivation. And, there's plenty of room. One of the barriers for young people who want to get into agriculture is, well, where do I get the land? I can't afford the land. Well, there's lots of land available. And it can be, done on a leasehold basis from some of these big underworked farms. And it's like tenant farming used to be, but probably in a much better, more win-win type of a relationship. But getting land to start a new farm or to transition a farm to something that's regenerative is actually, the door is wide open right now.
Yeah, I would say I think that the biggest barrier is not land availability or otherwise. It's actually existing zoning and building codes. Those are the enemies of innovation. And so we have lots of spaces where we could do things. They could be fields. They could be repurposed malls that have fallen, fallow. Like those things are all sort of ripe for being taken over and turned into new communities. But in terms of doing things that are rational and reasonable, that you can those things are not possible with existing, laws and codes. And I know this because I've sort of looked into it and I'm just like, it's maddening. There's not only no normalization, there's no real rational reason for a lot of it. It's just codified the way things were done, 100 years ago. It seems like a good idea. Exactly. We're going to keep doing that. And that is, I think, our greatest barrier to achieving any kind of real success here. So we're either going to have to do it and then ask for forgiveness or fight a hard fight to get there.
That's one of the things that Transition Towns does very nicely is, gets public sentiment to focus attention on some of the craziness of these old laws. And, because, the legislators and the bureaucrats, they don't really know what's going on the ground. Whereas if you bring them, rational, cogent argument for why it would be better for everybody, including their tax revenues, if they, loosen things up and update things, then they tend to come around. And I have to hand it to Transition Towns that, if you've ever heard of that, it's kind of an offshoot of permaculture, but they're doing a really good job of, changing that bureaucratic solidity, that ossification that's occurred over the past few centuries.
I think the tiny homes associations have also been pretty effective here in pushing through the right to be able to have tiny homes as ADUs, etc. But Maria, you've got a lot more knowledge in that area. Do you want to chime in about how you see policy changing with tiny home permissions?
Absolutely. I think that while it is, the current codes often aren't very open to this, it is, in my experience and a lot of the experiences of folks in the tiny home realm, that your local jurisdiction is quite willing to work with you. The biggest barrier is the fact that the folks that you're working with might not understand the concept as well as you do. So a lot of times people are in the position where they are essentially educating the person who is in the power position about what they want to do, why they want to do it, why it provides value. And a lot of times that person is like, well, you know what, I see why you would want to do that, and let's work together and see what we can do. So I think that's kind of an optimistic spin on it, but I do think that at least in the tiny home world, they're pretty open to adapting the codes if there's a reasonable route to do so.
Mm. Colleen, what's been your experience with food? But we'll come to you next, Mark. I'll just check in with Colleen. And what's been your experience of policy to do with food distribution? Because, you know, there obviously are very tight regulation, especially, you know, when it comes to organic, etc. Is that prohibitive? Is that stopping a lot of further regenerative agriculture progress?
I think what's happening there is that it's becoming pretty obvious at this point that the large monocrop agriculture is not working. We have dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico because of it. We have areas where the topsoil used to be 6 feet deep and is now 6 inches deep. We have last year and probably this year tremendous amount of flooding and loss of land. And so the people that I know who live in the midsection of the country, which has a lower population now than it did 70 years ago. And I think that, you know, that's something that we really need to look at, is we've got this huge midsection of our country it's the breadbasket supposedly of the world. Well, it's not anymore, and it's to the point of fragility that will only in some places allow for maybe 40 or 50 more harvests. And so we need to take this very seriously, and there are a lot of people, especially young ones, that are looking to the future with all of this. They're doing cover cropping. They're learning how to do it well. They are not tilling the land anymore, which is very destructive to soil. They're utilizing a lot of organic methodologies, but we do really need to contact our Congress people and our senators and push through legislation that is friendly to what we need to do for the future viability of our country. Because they have been protecting agribusinesses now for the last 20 years, and now those agribusinesses are shown not to be able to handle the stress. And so it's very important that all of us get involved. I mean, a lot of our legislators are following the money, and if you find out that your legislator is following the money, get rid of them, please. Because we honestly need to have people that care about the future, that care about our children and our grandchildren and beyond. And our country, when Europeans came here, had been managed by indigenous populations that knew how to do this. And no, I don't want to go back to that. But I think that we can take the best of technology. Stuart Allen is becoming becoming a fan, Stuart. You know, we can take technologies that are really vibrant and able to carry us into the future. We don't have to think about going back to some kind of austerity. I think we go forward to abundance, actually, with this thing. And so that's
you've actually done some work with the Utah legislature, haven't you?
Yes, actually, Utah's becoming kind of a flagship for changing legislative things. And now, of course, the FDA and the USDA still have legislation that we're going to have to change it on a nationwide basis. But we have seen in the state of Utah where we have lowered the barrier of entry for new farmers considerably over the last 3 years.
Well
Great.
done.
Good to share that around. Mark, what did you want to have to say?
Um, well, these have been very spot on. I think insights. What I'm trying to parse or reconcile them with is the experiences in various places around the world, which have way more dysfunctional basic systems of governance even than we do. Although I think the gap is closing, perhaps. But there is something called System D. This was a topic about 8 years ago. A French economist pointed out that about half the world economy is in the informal sector. Hernando Soto also earlier had talked about this. They're basically people who want to do legitimate things, legitimate business, build houses, but they can't get through a corrupt system. It's way too costly. They don't have connections, so they just do it. And as we see these convulsions now taking hold in institutions worldwide, their failure to deliver is going to bring more and more people into this parallel system. And in contrast to earlier eras, they'll be doing this with virtual resources, with internet everywhere, and with cell phones that give them deep choices in learning and health access and governance. So I think it's good for us, particularly if we're thinking about templates or creating examples that can spark interest not only in the United States, but potentially as this this alternative system gets more and more on its feet worldwide. That if we can explore ways for early wins, for shared success, to be part of Game B examples that will inspire many or help spread seeds for many different kinds of experiments. But the problem that many of the speakers here have talked about is the bottleneck with zoning codes, building codes, inspections, tax systems that are opaque. Food sovereignty is just shut down by so many regulations. I think the basic question is whether Game B communities go piecemeal and try to go after a change in one particular siloed area, or if in essence we can make it interesting, even politically, for zones of innovation, for pilot areas of comprehensive reform. Many of the white hairs on my head came from trying to go after policy reform in a kind of laser-like way. And you can win sometimes the siloed victory. But if the customs service is corrupt, or if the justice system is broken, the fact that you've made a change on paper in a particular field is swamped. And another thing, I think the background music in terms of the chaos and the fear that people in politics are increasingly facing is that if we come to them now with incremental change in a focused area, that is going to be drowned out by the urgencies and the sense of crisis. And so I think what Game B communities would be well encouraged to do is to see how can we combine these best of class innovations in terms of what can be done with food, what can be done with transportation, what can be done with habitats, what can be done with access to virtual learning, peer learning, on-demand learning, and as much as possible put together examples and toolkits which allow those places that realize they can't be incremental and hope to change the trend line to offer them something that gives hope and brings oxygen in across the board in limited pilot demonstration areas. And that one last thing on the score, many people in power are eager to look good on the various news outlets and media feeds. If we can create Game Bee community opportunities as a prize to be won, something that localities can be can become candidates to win something that's transformational and uplifting and hopeful and inclusive, making it instead of pushing on a string in the sense of looking for reform, the notion of creating a prize that reverses the usual dynamics, where we set a threshold in terms of what the quality of reforms and the scale of land trusts or other systems like it. And then the communities basically come to Game Bee and say, we've got these ingredients. And then various flavors and currents in Game Bee can say, we can make this work. That's a big part of what our May 1 and May 2 event, the Startup Society's Foundation Summit, we'll be exploring some of these kind of policy reform, deep policy reform opportunities. And I think given the magnitude and the quality of people who are drawn to Game Bee, that it may be possible to create early wins, things that create impact and splash and hope if we do things in a comprehensive path of reform.
Thanks, Mark. I really love that as a model to move forward, and also creating the honeypot. And the honeys will come. Yeah, I mean, and the bees will come. Harrison, what did you have something to contribute?
Well, I've been working with Colleen on State of Grace Living, and one of the approaches that we've made is we went to a relatively small town in Utah called Cedar City, and Cedar City is an old town. It was on the Spanish Trail that would go from east to west, and the way they bring horses up from the west to the Midwest, and the Indians lived there for hundreds of years, so it has a lot of history. And the sort of the fathers of the city there really want to do something to make Cedar City better and more attractive and bring in tourism. And all cities want to do well, they want to prosper, right? And Colleen and I went and visited with the sort of the inner circle, if you will, of Cedar City. And they're all a bunch of good old boys, and they've all got their own kind of pet projects. Like one of them is associated with this place that restores carriages, all kinds of different carriages. And another guy has a museum of all the things that happened in and around that area. I was amazed at how much history there was there. So the approach we've taken is, go in and talk to the people who live there, the influencers who actually live there, find out what they are trying to accomplish, and see what you can do to align with and further and coordinate their objectives. And that way you just sort of bypass a lot of the fight that you would normally have with legislature, because you've got good public relations on your side, and that usually trumps law.
Has anyone explored this? If you've got more than 100 people, you can create your own incorporated area. Is that something? This is just off the cuff, but Harrison, maybe think of that, because, you know, obviously going into small towns that are really only a few people that are sort of operating it, you know, it's not a established, you know, Game B style city. You know, has anyone sort of explored that as an option?
I think that what we've seen is, you know, there's a couple of thousand acres that we could acquire just south of that little city, and incorporate according to our own needs. It's you know, part of the land is in the city itself, and part is in the county, and so we've already explored how we would incorporate the county land, and then there is a way that you can get released from the city as well. Because the land that's in the city, we're only going to use it for agriculture anyway. So I think it would be pretty easy for them to let it go. But the thing that's been interesting to me about all of this is that people's imagination gets pinged, and a big part of what we want to do there is to create an incubator for new regenerative businesses as part of kind of a university structure, teaching all of the regenerative skills and philosophies and whatever. And so what we've noticed is that these small towns in middle America have typically gone under because the business of the community has not thrived in our current way of doing things. So if we can incubate new businesses that are part of this regenerative structure, we can headquarter those across the midsection of the country and rebuild towns around them. I mean, some of those towns are still there. They're kind of boarded up and whatever, but you can still make something of them. And there are artists that have bought up these little towns and created little artist communities and whatever. So there's a lot of things that can happen. But most farming communities need at least some solid business structures to support them. Most of the people who are farmers, you know, people look down on hobby farmers, and I have no idea why they would, you know. I mean, it's sad, but it's also very possible with kind of a diverse farm capacity. We know people who have as small as 2,000 or 200 just 2 acres, and have created businesses with those 2 acres that are bringing in about $100,000 a year. And so it's not necessary to have huge amounts of land, but it is very necessary to use that land well. And so we want to see that happen.
Well, you know, perhaps this mind shift that really has to take place, because I can really relate in terms of being in the Bay Area, and the venture-backed companies will look at a steady growth business and go, oh no, you know, we don't want that kind of thing. We have to go all the way, or it's over. So, but speaking of that, I mean, I'm really curious about people, and Mark prompted this yesterday to throw the cat amongst the pigeons, in terms of, you know, with you know, so many jobs obviously going to be displaced because of this, and then, you know, as years come up, the automation to do with robot production. You know, what are people's thoughts in terms of universal basic income, and potentially, you know, that workforce that can now go build their own tiny home, be in these sort of, you know, artist-led communities, or, you know, those sort of more smaller hands-on. So is the change going to come with that really production orientation, or will the robots, you know, race in and do it all for us?
I hope not.
I guess the point that I made yesterday when we sort of talked about this is I don't really think the robots are taking over anytime soon. the production of robots, and that requires a tremendous amount of industry infrastructure. It really requires the full resources of Game A to come to bear to make those things. And you're not doing like electronics on a small scale in a little Game B community. I mean, that requires a semiconductor fab and a whole bunch of other stuff. And so in order to get to that point, you have to have thousands or tens of thousands of at-scale Game B communities that each specialize, that then trade amongst themselves, and that's a long way away. So really, robotization of things is not going to happen in a meaningful way in Game B until there's great maturity. So I think in the short term, it's going back to people are going to be doing a lot more, but it's not like we're going back to, ye olde dirt farming and, that kind of stuff. It's going to be employing technology and know-how and, math and physics and science to make better things from more modest materials. And I think that will be, you're talking about high spec, small communities. It's not like you're going to live in a hut, we're working with a reduced palette, but it's a refined palette of higher grade things. And I think that what we work with there makes it easier to scale. And then, it'll be a mix of sort of modern basic. And I think that's sort of the starting point that we're looking at. So robotization is only really going to happen at scale. The most dystopian future, where there are no Game B communities, Game A totally wins, and it's run by a few, ultra trillionaires, and everybody else is a serf.
Right.
And
Well said.
Sorry, I think there could be kind of a rolling transition where, for example, with driverless vehicles, potentially millions of people who drive trucks and Uber and taxis and so forth will feel the effects of that, and drones in terms of deliveries. And with COVID, I think being a case in point that there may be markets emerging for very neighborhood-oriented delivery services that do use these kind of systems. And certainly in a lot of the service industries now, things where we used to hear human beings at the other end of the phone, we're hearing human-like increasingly systems that are able to do things that once employed people. Yuval Harari has written some books that are quite chilling in a way, saying that he sees a possibility that we're going to bifurcate, that essentially 80% of the population will, in today's terms of economic value, become the unnecessariat, not just the proletariat or precariat, but the unnecessariat. And the 20% who are still involved probably will be more in the innovation and creative space and in the human services that can't be automated. So those kind of scenarios, I think, are a concern. He does also say that he thinks since machines are going to outdo us in terms of physical productive labor and cognitive labor, much of it as well, that the one thing that human beings have that will be the high ground for the future is hopefully emotional intelligence. And the more that, I think one of the great attractors of Game B is this sense of, okay, the head and the heart and the hands, even if the head work and the heart and the hands work is giving more and more to technology.
You got muted, Mark.
You're muted.
Oh, I'm so sorry. That was me doing the unmute. Sorry, Mark.
Sorry, I don't know what part got chopped up, but the sense that the heart based living and relationships will become what humans increasingly will be doing. And the more Game B communities can nourish that in ways that are inclusive and maybe virtual at first in terms of engagement, that potentially would be what carries the Game Bee civilization and far and wide, rather than going for narrow niches.
I've always, it's been my observation that the technical breakthroughs that eliminate drudgery free up more time to create something else. So it's not as if, I don't feel anyway, that it's not as if at some point we're just going to not have anything to do because it's all done for us, right? The more capability we acquire through technology, the more things we want to do with it, right? Like, 3D printing. You don't have to have necessarily a big manufacturing company where everybody commutes to in order to work together to build things. You could have distributed networks of different parts being made. We really can't imagine, it's like, think back in the 70s, all we had was a fax machine or something, right? And now we've got instantaneous communication on several different apps and different devices and all kinds of, plethora of things to watch and read, and the universe is at our fingertips. And maybe it's because of those advances as to why now we're here thinking about creating an even better society.
Stuart, did you want to chime in?
I think the original question was about universal basic income, and I think we also sort of deviated from that, didn't actually take it head on. And I think that it is an interesting question, and I think that something like that, whether you call it a freedom dividend or universal basic, is really the only thing that's going to buttress some of this sort of deep decline that we have in the short term. It's going to probably become an imperative, and if we don't do that, then you're looking at almost certain collapse in a lot of cases. And related to that, I think that the early Game Bee communities are by necessity going to have to be regressive in the way that they address, residents and acceptance. And this goes to the governance side of things that I haven't even talked about at all. But if Mark has gotten an earful from me about this in the past, so probably do a whole thing about that. I don't want to derail us in the last 5 minutes, but it is related and it is an interesting topic.
Yeah. Well, that we do need to do this again, but maybe just a quick hands up. Who thinks that, this coronavirus and the quarantine is actually helping progress the Game Bee community's ideas and agenda? Who thinks that? I'm
not as optimistic, unfortunately, as the rest of you guys. I think it's bringing out at the top some of the worst behavior, which, while it does raise awareness in a way, it actually also undermines a lot of the bedrock that we need to get these things done. So it's like one step forward, one step back. And, it's basically we have to stay the course, right? So I do want to be optimistic. I think I try to be a little bit more sort of realistic about it, which is that, maybe we're moving sideways. There are more people paying attention, but the headwinds are greater. So yes, this is, potentially we can turn this into a win.
I was listening to Governor Cuomo give his briefing, and one of the things that kind of impressed me was the fact that he realized that he's had to spend more time with his family. And, usually it was a very superficial, ships in the night type of a relationship. Hi, how you doing? What do you need? I love you. Bye-bye, right? And because people have been sequestered at home, they've actually had to deal with each other and get into communication with each other and find out who that other person is and what's going on with them. So in that regard, we had become so separated and so disconnected from each other, from our families, from our communities, from our government, etc. And this kind of gave a pause to force people basically back into communication, which I believe is a universal solvent.
Here. And also force people to see how much nature comes back when we slow down.
Exactly. Just a quick thing. I noticed when I went outside how sweet the air smelled and how many animals and birds. It's like, hey, this is okay. Maybe we should pause this periodically.
Yeah, I think that is a really good take home from this all. So we wanted to just announce that there's going to be a virtual Startup Society Foundation Summit, which is titled Startup Societies in a Post-COVID World. And that's happening on May 1st. So registration is where, Mark? Where can people find information about that?
If you go to the startupsocieties.org site, right at the bottom of the page is a banner that will take you there. And would love to see all of you in a couple of weeks.
We certainly will be, for sure. And I'd love to do another panel with you all. It's been so enjoyable. Thank you so much for taking the time to be on this conversation. And I'll be sharing it out on YouTube.
Wonderful.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Closing out the meeting. Bye.
All right. Bye.